100 plus adjectives to avoid using the word very in English. Lethargic, instead of very sleepy. Gorgeous, instead of very beautiful. Delicious, instead of very tasty. Abrupt, instead of very sudden. Equitable, instead of very fair. Inequitable, instead of very unfair. Intelligent, instead of very clever. Skeletal, instead of very skinny. Self-effacing, instead of very humble. Noisy, instead of very loud. Apprehensive, instead of very nervous. Solitary, instead of very lonely. Silent, instead of very quiet. Exquisite, instead of very beautiful. Valorous, instead of very brave. Prosperous, instead of very successful. Fortunate, instead of very lucky. Peculiar, instead of very strange. Sincere, instead of very honest. Grave, instead of very serious. Obese, instead of very fat. Sluggish, instead of very slow. Blustery, instead of very windy. Petrified, instead of very frightened. Amiable, instead of very friendly. Desolate, instead of very empty. Ecstatic, instead of very happy. Awful, instead of very bad. Awesome, instead of very good. Terrific, instead of very great. Effective, instead of very useful. Arduous, instead of very difficult. Exceptional, instead of very special. Huge, instead of very big. Indolent, instead of very lazy. Serene, instead of very calm. Furious, instead of very angry. Massive instead of very big. Ancient instead of very old. Destitute instead of very poor. Tiny instead of very small. Profound instead of very deep. Eager instead of very willing. Conscious instead of very aware. Impeccable instead of very perfect. Likely instead of very probable. Unlikely instead of very improbable. Freezing instead of very cold. Innovative instead of very creative. Cruel instead of very mean. Overjoyed instead of very glad. Fruitful instead of very fertile. Sweltering instead of very hot. Soaked instead of very wet. Expansive instead of very wide. Infirm instead of very ill. Supportive instead of very helpful. Alike instead of very similar. Limited instead of very few. Perplexed instead of very confused. Spotless instead of very clean. Starving instead of very hungry. Parched instead of very thirsty. Hideous instead of very ugly. Certain instead of very sure. Brief instead of very short. Simple instead of very easy. Extraordinary instead of very unusual. Envious instead of very jealous. Scarce instead of very rare. Hilarious instead of very funny. Hefty instead of very heavy. Astonished instead of very amazed. Exhilarating instead of very exciting. Bustling, instead of very crowded. Pungent, instead of very smelly. Renowned, instead of very famous. Exhausted, instead of very tired. Keen, instead of very sharp. Timid, instead of very shy. Dull, instead of very boring. Sorrowful, instead of very sad. Faggied out, instead of very tired. Battered, instead of very hurt. Costly, instead of very dear. Gifted, instead of very talented. Excruciating, instead of very painful. Rigorous, instead of very strict. Dogmatic, instead of very opinionated. Optimistic, instead of very positive. Pessimistic, instead of very negative. Slack, instead of very loose. Exact, instead of very accurate. Rapid, instead of very quick. Acute, instead of very severe. Idiotic, instead of very stupid. Perilous, instead of very dangerous. Precious, instead of very valuable. Arid, instead of very dry. Filthy, instead of very dirty. Frail, instead of very weak. Distraught, instead of very upset. If this lesson was helpful for you, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel for more English lessons. That would help me out a lot. Thanks.